You're standing in the middle of it, blinking like a stunned cow in a thunderstorm. Stone walls rise above your head, impossibly high. The ceilings, vaulted. The arches, pointy. The floors, probably haven't been cleaned since the Virgin Mary was born. But that doesn't matter, because this is the market. And yes, it's big, it's beautiful, and it has everything. Well, not everything, everything. You won't find love here, or dental hygiene, but in terms of medieval shopping, this place is paradise. You shuffle forward, boots scraping against centuries-old stone, trying to remember why you came. Was it eggs? Soap? A goose? A husband? Someone yells fresh turnips, like they're announcing royal treasure. Someone else yells, he's stealing, which, to be fair, is kind of the same thing. Your nose is already full, with the smell of fish, sweat, wet straw, and something that might be cheese, or might be a dead rat. No one's quite sure, but you don't mind. This is the one place where you can find everything you didn't know you needed, and everything you definitely can't afford. The medieval mall, minus the escalators. It's not exactly glamorous. There's no music playing, no scented candles or glittery window displays, but it's alive. You see a man selling shoes made out of rope, actual rope, as in these used to tie up a cow, rope. Next to him, a woman yelling about the healing powers of dried frog skin. Her stall is decorated with skulls, feathers, and a suspiciously human-looking tooth. You wander past a man selling holy relics, which are really just bones he found in his backyard and rubbed with garlic. Then there's the spice merchant. His little wooden table is covered in tiny cloth sacks tied with string, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and a price tag that basically says, only if you're royalty. But the smells, oh, the smells. You breathe them in like they might fix your life. For a second, it almost feels like they do. Every stall tells a story. The blacksmith's corner is hot, smoky, and sounds like someone is constantly trying to wake up a dragon. Sparks fly, children stare. Someone always almost loses an eyebrow. Over in the corner, a farmer is selling fresh eggs that are debatably fresh. One of them already has legs. No one cares. There's a boy balancing a goose on his head, yelling, cheapest birds in town. And frankly, he's not wrong. That goose looks mentally checked out. And then, the fabric stall. You stop, touch it. It's rough, coarse wool that will scratch your skin into submission. But it's dyed, bright reds, faded blues, mud-stained yellows. For a moment, your eyes forget the dirt and only see the color. A poor woman picks up a scrap and sighs. She knows she can't afford it, but she holds it anyway, like a dream she'll keep for later. The soundtrack of the marketplace, it's not quiet. It's never quiet. There are chickens screaming, pigs grunting, a man playing the lute, like it owes him money. Somebody's baby is crying. Somebody's husband is definitely not helping. Arguments fly like arrows. No, you said 2 for a penny. I said 2 if you bring your own basket. That's not even real honey. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. I saw your son pee in it. Nobody apologizes. That's not how markets work. You bargain. You lie. You laugh. You walk away pretending you didn't just pay double for stale bread. Fashionably, filthy people dress up to go to the market. Well, dress up is generous. They wear their second best tunic, the one with only one hole. Some women tuck sprigs of herbs into their braids, not for style, for smell. Others smear rose water behind their ears or lavender on their sleeves, hoping to mask the fact they haven't bathed since Pentecost. One man walks around in a velvet robe 2 sizes too big. Rumor says he stole it from a dead bishop. He claims it's noble fashion. Everyone else just avoids sitting near him. Still, there's something oddly beautiful in it. The way people show up, scrubbed and patched, just to feel a little human again. Where gossip travels faster than plague. You learn more in 5 minutes at the market than you ever would in church. Who's marrying who? Who's cheating on who? Who's got boils? Who's got money? Who says they have money, but definitely doesn't? It's like medieval Twitter, but louder. And with more goats, you hear a rumor that the baker's daughter is pregnant. Another that the mayor is secretly growing turnips inside his cloakroom. And your favorite, someone saw a night cry last week after stepping on a snail. Okay, that one might be true. Not just shopping, survival. People don't come here for fun. They come because they have to. A mother counts out coins with shaking hands. She needs barley. She needs salt. She needs something for her sick son who hasn't eaten in days. A man with one leg leans on a broken crutch, trying to sell onions. No one buys any, but one woman hands him a scrap of bread. He cries, pretends he has dust in his eye. A child steals an apple, gets caught. The vendor chases him with a stick, but then hands him a second apple and tells him not to come back without his mother because the market is brutal. But it's also oddly kind. A church, a tavern, and a pit of mud most markets sit right outside the church. God in the front, chaos in the back. On one side, prayers and incense. On the other, sausages and shouting. And in the middle, mud. Always mud. Doesn't matter the season. You step in it. You slip. Someone laughs. Then they slip too. By midday, half the town has mud in their teeth. By evening, no one even notices. The art of not starving. You don't always come home with what you wanted. Sometimes your eggs are cracked. Sometimes your cabbage has worms. Sometimes your chicken dies on the way home. But you came. You traded. You talked. You saw people. You reminded yourself you're still part of something. Even if it smells like goat pee and regret, you bring your sack inside. Lay out your treasures. A loaf, a little honey, a wedge of cheese so hard it could break your jaw. And somehow, that's enough. The market didn't care if you were poor or tired or broken. It opened its arms, yelled in your face, and handed you a turnip with a wink. It gave you noise when your house was too quiet, laughter when your heart was heavy, a place to be seen, even if no one remembered your name. It wasn't clean. It wasn't fair. It didn't smell nice. But it was everything. And for one loud, muddy, ridiculous afternoon, it was yours. You're sitting on a stone bench, squinting at the sun, and wondering if your sandals are melting. It's hot. It's dusty. And somewhere, in the distance, someone is yelling about a scroll written in 3 languages that might finally explain how fish breathe. Welcome to Alexandria, not just the city, the idea, because this place wanted everything, every scroll, every manuscript, every half-finished grocery list scratched on pottery. If it had ink on it, they wanted it. The goal was simple: own every book on earth. The method? Slightly less noble. A library so big it could crush your house. The Great Library wasn't some cute little corner bookshop. It was a monster. Shelves taller than grown men, corridors that never ended, scrolls piled on scrolls, stacked like lasagna. If lasagna had footnotes in Greek and smelled like mildew and hope, you walk in and it's silent, too silent, like even the dust is thinking. Scribes sit cross-legged in corners, copying Plato with one hand and chewing on reeds with the other. Ink stains everywhere. No one's bathed in days. It's perfect. You don't come here to borrow. You come here to drown. In words, in theories, in arguments about whether dreams come from the gods or just from bad cheese. Nice scroll. We'll take it. Now, here's the fun part. Alexandria didn't ask nicely. If your ship docked in their harbor, surprise, the librarians were already climbing aboard. They'd take your books, all of them, copy them, keep the originals, hand you back the duplicates, and say, "You're welcome." It was intellectual piracy, except instead of parrots and eye patches, it was tunics and judgmental glances. They wanted Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian medicine, Indian mathematics, Roman law, African folk tales, Greek philosophy, Chinese herbal guides, all of it. Didn't matter if they could read it. They just had to have it. Who even runs this place? Technically, scholars. Realistically, obsessive nerds with too much power and not enough hobbies. There were priests who read poetry, astronomers who thought stars had feelings, doctors who thought leeches were the future, philosophers who argued for 10 hours about whether chairs exist, and at the center of it all, Ptolemy, or his cousin, or his cousin's cousin. It didn't matter. If your last name wasn't Scroll, no one cared. They poured money into it, hired anyone who could write without drooling, and made collecting knowledge a full-time job. What's actually in there? Let's just say a lot. But also, no one's really sure, because Alexandria wasn't organized like your local library. No Dewey Decimal System, no genre sections, just labels like medicine, probably, or stuff about birds. There were scrolls on how to cure hiccups with beet juice, maps of lands that might not exist, epic poems longer than most marriages, recipes, rants, inventions, incredibly boring stuff about tax policy, and the best part? Most of it was wrong. But they didn't care, because to them, collecting was more important than correcting. The goal wasn't truth, it was everything. The dream was big. The storage? Not so much. At some point, they had to admit the scrolls were winning. There were just too many. So they started stashing them in temples, in warehouses, in hallways, probably in someone's pantry. The Serapeum, a fancy backup library, became the overflow bin. Imagine being so obsessed with books, you build a second giant building just to hold your extra thoughts. But that's Alexandria for you. They didn't stop, didn't sleep, didn't say enough. Even their copies had copies because one copy is never enough. They didn't just duplicate scrolls, they duplicated the duplicates, triple checked everything, hired teams of tired eyed men to rewrite the same thing over and over like ancient human printers, but slower and angrier. And if you think your job is boring, imagine writing on the movement of celestial spheres by hand, then realizing you left out a sphere. So, did it work? Yes, for a while. They became the Google of the ancient world. If Google smelled like ink, was made of papyrus, and occasionally caught fire, scholars came from everywhere to read, to study, to argue. It became the center of the thinking world, a magnet for the curious, the clever, and the deeply annoying. But of course, it couldn't last, because when you build something that precious, somebody's going to burn it down. The fires, everyone argues. About no one agrees on who did it. Maybe Julius Caesar, accidentally torching the docks while pretending to be a war genius. Maybe invading armies, treating wisdom like kindling. Maybe bureaucratic neglect. Maybe angry mobs. Maybe just time. It probably didn't all vanish in one night. More like a slow, smoky heartbreak, scroll by scroll, shelf by shelf, until all that was left was ash and regret. You can't collect the whole world. But they tried. They were arrogant. They were brilliant. They were absolutely out of their minds. But they believed, really believed, that knowledge could hold the world together. That if they just read enough, they could fix anything, even death, even heartbreak, even war. Spoiler, they couldn't. But they left something behind anyway. Not just scrolls or myths or half-burned catalogs, but the idea that human curiosity is worth building temples for, even if those temples crumble. Final thought before you sleep, they didn't have Kindles, they didn't have hard drives, they had ink-stained fingers and an obsession, and maybe that's enough, because long after the books were gone, the dream still whispered through the ruins. Write it down, save it, someone might need it someday. You're standing in line behind a man with scrolls poking out of every pocket, and you can't help thinking, this place wasn't built for reading, it was built to show off. The Library of Alexandria didn't whisper, come study quietly. It shouted, behold our brain muscles. It wasn't just the largest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, it was a status symbol, an academic power move, a massive intellectual peacock feather, wagging proudly in the face of the rest of the world. Because when Alexandria built its library, it wasn't trying to help people. It was trying to say, we're smarter than you, and richer, and also, we own your books now. Knowledge? Yes, but also, vibes. The library was located in the Mausion, a word that literally means temple of the muses. That's right, they built an actual temple for ideas, marble columns, courtyards with statues of dead geniuses, perfumed scholars debating astronomy while pigeons pooped overhead. And it wasn't just for studying, it was a full package. Gardens, lecture halls, dining rooms, even a zoo, because nothing says serious intellectual center like trying to study geometry while a monkey screams in the background. This was academia meets luxury resort, a brain spa, a think tank with olive trees, and surprisingly aggressive peacocks. We don't need an army. We have papyrus. Plups P. Ptolemy. I and his descendants weren't fools. They knew controlling information was the real power move. Why invade people when you can just outthink them? So they poured money into scrolls, scholars, translators, scribes, whatever it took to make Alexandria the beating heart of all human knowledge, or at least to look like it, because when foreign dignitaries visited, they didn't take them to battlefields. They took them here, to halls lined with thousands of scrolls, to scholars who could quote 5 religions before breakfast, to debates so complicated they'd make your ears bleed, and everyone left thinking the same thing. We're never winning a quiz night against these people. It was less library card and more you wish you were us. There were no casual visitors. You didn't just pop in to grab a scroll on cabbage farming. To enter the library, you had to be somebody, a scholar, a poet, a philosopher, or at least very good at pretending. And even then, you might get stuck in the copy room for 10 years, rewriting Aristotle in a language you barely speak, while eating boiled lentils and losing your eyesight. But still, people came from Greece, from India, from Africa, from everywhere, because Alexandria had what no one else did, a kingdom of scrolls, and the royal smugness that came with it, the original academic clout machine. You think modern universities brag? Alexandria basically invented the humble brag. Oh, your city has an oracle? Cute. We just translated Sumerian stargazing manuals and wrote a 400 scroll guide on the ethics of fish ownership. They didn't do things halfway. They had whole departments dedicated to cataloging catalogs. They invented the concept of bibliography. Yes, that list in the back of your paper that no one ever reads? Thank Alexandria. And they expected their scholars to perform. You didn't just sit and read. You gave lectures. You published theories. You argued loudly, preferably in multiple languages, with dramatic hand gestures, because every scroll added to the shelves was another gold medal, another jewel in their academic crown. Don't just collect knowledge, weaponize it. Alexandria's real flex wasn't just having knowledge, it was owning the knowledge of others. They'd seize texts from ships, as you know, but they also hunted rare scrolls across continents, paid enormous sums, traded favors, maybe even blackmailed a few authors. One popular tactic: borrow rare works from other cities under the promise of copying them and then just not returning them. Oops, must have gotten lost. But hey, look, we have a fresh copy. It was ancient plagiarism dressed up as patriotism, and everyone hated them for it. But they didn't care, because the bigger the library, the bigger the ego. More than a library, a message. To the ancient world, Alexandria wasn't just a city, it was a statement, a place that said, we can read your language, interpret your gods, and improve your medicine, and we'll probably take credit for it too. The library was their megaphone, their lighthouse, their giant glowing brain emoji carved into the sands of Egypt. Every scroll they collected said, we matter more than you. Every debate said, we think harder than you. Every new student who came in, overwhelmed and underfed, said, okay, maybe I am stupid. And that's how they liked it. What happens to a flex when the world moves on? The tragedy. It worked too well. Alexandria became so proud of being brilliant, it forgot how fragile brilliance can be. A few fires, a few rulers who didn't like facts, a few centuries of dust, and suddenly the Great Flex became a ghost story, a monument to what was, but the echo still flexes even now, thousands of years later. People still talk about it, still dream about it, still wonder what was lost in those scrolls, because for all its ego, all its snobbery, all its dramatic librarian behavior, Alexandria believed in something. That human knowledge, messy, confusing, half wrong, was still worth fighting for, still worth showing off. And honestly, if you had that many scrolls, you'd probably flex too. Final thought. Before you sleep, it wasn't humble. It wasn't perfect, but it was magnificent. A library so ambitious, it tried to outshine empires, and for a little while it did. You've just arrived, sand in your shoes, sweat on your brow, absolutely no idea what you're walking into. The harbor's loud, the streets are louder, and somewhere in the middle of it all, someone's arguing about whether the moon affects garlic. Congratulations, you've made it to Alexandria, not just a city, a full blown intellectual rave. This is where ideas came, not to be shelved, but to dance. Forget quiet. This library had drama. Let's get one thing straight. The Library of Alexandria wasn't some calm, quiet sanctuary with hushed whispers and overdue fines. It was a theatrical event, scrolls flying, scribes arguing, scholars pacing barefoot in circles, muttering about metaphysics. One guy's translating Egyptian astrology, another's rewriting Homer, again, because apparently no one can agree on how many ships showed up. Meanwhile, the medical department is trying to prove sneezing resets the soul. No one's ruling it out. Every scroll had a backstory. They weren't just collecting knowledge, they were collecting drama. One scroll might have traveled across the desert tied to a camel, another smuggled out of a collapsing empire in someone's boot, a third, possibly fake, but written in such beautiful handwriting, no one had the heart to say anything. People copied everything: recipes, dream interpretations, treatises on toenail fungus. No filter, and you could never be sure what you were getting: a scientific breakthrough or some guy's very passionate rant about raisins. But that was the point. Scholars by day, divas by night. You couldn't just be smart here. You had to perform it. Being a thinker in Alexandria meant constant debates, dramatic exits, passive aggressive scroll annotations. If you didn't offend three philosophers before lunch, were you even trying? They argued in courtyards, on rooftops, probably in their sleep. And the worst insult you could throw wasn't "you're wrong." It was "you clearly haven't read Parmenides." Oof. It was basically a giant, ancient think tank. With sandals, you know that one person who won't shut up at dinner about consciousness, time travel, and what dreams really mean. Now imagine 2,000 of them in the same place at once. Some were funded by the state, Others showed up just to argue for food. All of them? Convinced they were right. It was chaos. Brilliant, sand-covered chaos. Oh, you're smart. Prove it. Loudly. In Alexandria, being book smart wasn't enough. You had to back it up. In the forum, in the lecture hall, at the market while holding a chicken. Anywhere was fair game. They had public debates with crowds, booing, cheering. Occasionally, someone threw bread. 1 minute you're discussing Plato. The next, someone's shouting about whether worms have souls. Welcome to the intellectual Olympics. Everyone showed up. Eventually, if you were a thinker worth anything, you ended up in Alexandria. Greeks, Persians, Indians, Egyptians, maybe even that one guy from the hills who just liked drawing triangles. They brought their ideas, their languages, their strange food, and stranger theories. It didn't matter if your worldview made 0 sense. If it was interesting, you were in. Because this wasn't just a library, it was a melting pot of madness. And somehow, it worked. Copy first. Ask. Questions never. If a scroll entered the city, it was copied. Period. Didn't matter if it was about advanced astronomy or how to pickle goat tongues in seawater. Everything was worth preserving, even the bad stuff, especially the bad stuff, because sometimes the bad stuff turned out to be genius later, or at least funny. The motto might as well have been, "We don't throw away ideas, we hoard them until they make sense." The librarians were rock stars, okay. Not literally. They didn't tour. They didn't have fan clubs. But in Alexandria, these guys were legends. Callimachus wrote the first library catalog, probably complained about it the whole time. Eratosthenes figured out the Earth's circumference with shadows and sticks. And Hypatia? She did math and philosophy, while people accused her of witchcraft, which, in ancient terms, just meant she was smarter than everyone else. These were the Beyoncé, Einstein, and Weird Uncle Steve of ancient academia, all in one place. The air smelled like ink and overconfidence. Walking through the Mouseion felt like stepping into a cloud of papyrus dust and unshakable self-importance. People recited theories like poetry, quoted texts older than their grandparents, wrote on scraps, bark, pottery, whatever they could find. And if you disagreed, good. That's how ideas partied. They weren't afraid of confusion. They loved confusion. They rolled around in it like cats in scrolls. Because the messier it got, the more interesting it became. And then it ended. Eventually, the party slowed down. Empires fell. Priorities shifted. People got tired of scrolls and started liking swords again. Then came the fires, the looters, the silence, and that loud, messy, glorious brain bash of a city became a legend. But the party echoes. And some ideas are too loud to disappear. Some cities are too strange to forget. Alexandria was one of those. It wasn't clean. It wasn't perfect. It definitely wasn't quiet. But it was alive, like a living encyclopedia that drank too much wine. And every time someone argues in a cafe, rewrites an old theory, or asks a weird question about moonlight and mushrooms, Alexandria lives again. Final thought before you sleep. So next time, your brain won't shut up at 3 a.m. Next time you Google something bizarre, Next time you scribble a terrible idea in the margins, just know you'd fit right in, because Alexandria didn't want silence, it wanted noise. And you're the perfect kind of loud. You're squinting up at a building so big it makes your donkey nervous. It's made of white stone, tall columns, and the faint smell of burning oil and arrogance. Welcome to Alexandria. Specifically, the building where one man tried to stuff the entire thinking part of the world under one roof. And no, not metaphorically. Ptolemy didn't just want a library. He wanted the planet's brain, archived, cataloged, and neatly shelved right here. Because in his mind, if Egypt couldn't conquer the world with swords, it would conquer it with scrolls. He wasn't a scholar. He was a collector. Ptolemy. I wasn't exactly a bookworm. He was a former general, one of Alexander the Great's favorites, who knew a few things: how to win battles, how to throw banquets, and how to surround himself with people way smarter than him. So, when he became king of Egypt, he had a thought, what if I could own all the thoughts? Boom, the great library was born, not as a peaceful temple of learning, but as an intellectual flex so large it needed its own postal code, the Mouse-yon, aka the world's most chaotic brain cell. He called it the Mouse-yon, a place dedicated to the muses. But it wasn't cute or poetic. It was a factory of ideas: historians, mathematicians, doctors, dream interpreters, guys with beards, so long they needed assistants. It was like locking the internet in a building with no exit. Arguments echoed through hallways. People tripped over scrolls. No one ever agreed on anything, but that was the point. You don't build the world's brain for comfort. You build it for thinking so hard it hurts. Step 1. Steal everything. Ptolemy didn't ask for donations. He wasn't sending "support your local library" letters. He ordered every ship that docked in Alexandria to hand over its books. Yes, every single scroll on board. Then his scribes would copy them. Then they'd keep the originals. What did the owners get back? A nice little knockoff version, if they were lucky. It was less global knowledge project and more scholarly mugging. Step 2. Hire the weirdest geniuses. Alive, Ptolemy filled the place with people who could measure the earth with a stick, cure fevers with mold, and explain dreams involving goats. And he didn't care where they came from: Greece, Babylon, Persia, wherever. If you had ideas, a pen, and a healthy disrespect for authority, you were hired. Some even got free food and lodging. Others got papyrus poisoning and arguments about Aristotle. But they all got the same message: welcome to the world's brain. Now get to work. Step 3. Organize the chaos. Kind of. You can't have a billion scrolls lying around. So Ptolemy's team created categories, catalogs, filing systems, possibly invented the first book spine labels, possibly cried while doing it. One guy, Callimachus, wrote a library index that took up 120 scrolls on its own, and still, nobody could find anything. It was a system built by geniuses, which meant no one normal could use it. So what was in this brain? Everything. Poetry from Sappho, science from India, Egyptian medicine, Greek drama, Babylonian star charts, hilariously inaccurate maps, recipes, prophecies, shopping lists, philosophy so confusing it probably started 3 cults, and a whole bunch of stuff no one understood, but they copied it anyway, just in case. Because when you're building the world's brain, no thought is too weird, except maybe the one about pigeons controlling weather. That one didn't make the cut. The library wasn't just for learning, it was a weapon. Knowledge is power. Ptolemy knew that. The more scrolls you had, the more scholars you attracted. The more scholars you had, the more ideas you created. And the more ideas you had, the harder it was for anyone to challenge you. It wasn't just about facts, it was about influence. And the great library became Alexandria's strongest army, an army of thinkers in sandals. Did it work? Oh, absolutely. Until it didn't. For a while, Alexandria was the brain of the ancient world. Scholars came, ideas blossomed, scrolls piled up like laundry no one wanted to fold. But then came fire, war, jealous empires, bad rulers with no interest in books, and eventually the lights dimmed, the scrolls vanished, the brain went quiet. But Ptolemy's dream echoes, even if the building's gone, even if the scrolls are ash, even if nobody remembers what On the Anatomy of Worms was actually about. The idea that all human thought could live in one place still echoes in libraries, in universities, in hard drives, in you. Because whether you're solving equations or Googling Do Cows Dream, you're feeding the same brain Ptolemy tried to build. Final thought before you sleep: he didn't want fame, he didn't want gold, he wanted every idea ever written, all in one place, all in one lifetime, all under one dusty, brilliant, impossible roof. And honestly, that's one heck of a bedtime story. You're trying to sleep, but the sky is glowing orange. The harbor smells like smoke and panic. Somewhere nearby, someone's yelling in Latin and dramatically waving a sword. And you're clutching a scroll about lunar eclipses and wondering if history just stubbed its toe or lost a limb. Because tonight is that night, the night Julius Caesar accidentally lit the great library on fire. Yeah, that Julius. Mr. Veni, Vidi, oopsie. The setup: war, ships, and too much swagger. It's 48 BCE. Caesar has just rolled into Alexandria, cape flowing, ego at full volume. He's chasing his enemy, Pompey, who's already been conveniently murdered by the Egyptians. Caesar's not thrilled. Cleopatra's playing 4D chess in the background, and the entire city is tense enough to snap in half. Then, because why not, Caesar finds himself under siege at the royal palace, trapped, outnumbered, probably out of clean togas. So he does what any Roman general with a flair for the dramatic would do. He orders his men to set the docks on fire. A classic burn the fleet so they can't use it move. Except, the fire got a little ambitious. The docks burned, the ships burned, then the warehouses, then the marketplace, and then, oops, the scroll storage buildings. Because someone forgot to mention, hey Julius, the Library of Alexandria is right next to that. You know, the one with half the known knowledge of Earth. It wasn't the main building. Most historians say it was the overflow storage. You know, the just in case, rooms where thousands of scrolls were kept because the big library ran out of shelf space. And those rooms? Ash. What exactly did we lose? Don't ask. It'll hurt. Nobody wrote down a neat little list of what burned, but imagine thousands of scrolls. Science, medicine, history, weird poetry about turnips. Gone in one night. Gone. Ancient maps. Gone. Rare philosophies from Persia. Gone. Egyptian medical texts about eye surgery written 1,000 years before Caesar was even born. One spark, and centuries of knowledge went up like kindling at a toga party. Did Julius even notice? Here's the wild part. Caesar probably didn't care. He had bigger things on his mind, like winning a civil war and Cleopatra. And let's be honest, he wasn't exactly known for whispering sweet nothings to ancient scrolls. To him, books were tools, not treasures. If they burned, well, veni, vidi, igni. Historians still argue about it. Was it really Caesar's fault? Did the fire reach the main library? Was it just the storage rooms? No one knows for sure, because the people who did know, well, their scrolls were in the building that burned down. Some ancient writers blame him directly, others give him a pass. But the truth is, when you start lighting things on fire in a city made of wood, papyrus, and ambition, you're going to ruin somebody's library. The first loss was the deepest. Here's what we do know. That fire was a turning point, not just in Alexandria. In human history, it proved something awful, that even the greatest library in the world, built by kings and thinkers and dreamers, could be undone in a single, careless moment. It wasn't the only fire. It might not even have been the worst, but it was the first real wound, the one that never quite healed. The tragedy wasn't just the flames, it was the silence that followed. All those scrolls, all those voices snuffed out, ideas that had traveled oceans, argued through generations, copied lovingly by hand, reduced to smoke, no backup, no cloud storage, just cinders in the Egyptian wind. And yet, Alexandria lived on, sort of. The main library? It probably survived. For a while, scholars kept studying, scribes kept copying, people kept arguing about whether Plato had ever touched a vegetable. But the fire had left its mark, a scar, a warning that even the brightest minds are no match for someone with a torch and bad aim. Julius went on to be Julius. After the fire, he won the war, dated Cleopatra, changed history, got stabbed. But the library, it began to fade, not all at once, but slowly, painfully, scroll by scroll, until eventually no one remembered exactly what was lost, only that it was everything. Final thought before you sleep. Sometimes history isn't erased by villains. Sometimes it's burned by accident, by someone trying to survive a battle, trying to win a war, trying to impress a queen. And somewhere in the background, the world's greatest library quietly catches fire. And the rest of us, we just hope someone, somewhere, remembered what it said. You're standing in front of a stone building that looks unimpressed. No columns, no statues, no inscriptions of wisdom etched in gold, just a warehouse, dusty, plain, probably smells like mold and wet papyrus. And yet, this could have been the second brain of the world. Or not. because no one really agrees if it even burned, or when, or how, or if it existed the way we imagine it. Welcome to the mystery box of ancient knowledge, the storage facility of the Great Library of Alexandria, the backup brain, the side hustle of human history. So, what was this place? Picture it like this: the Library of Alexandria was so full of scrolls, it was overflowing, so they built a backup stash, likely in the Serapeum, a grand temple dedicated to Serapis, the god of fusion and confusion. It wasn't as famous as the main library, but it was big, sacred, smelled like incense and old parchment. And if the stories are true, it held thousands of scrolls, maybe even more than the main library itself. This was the Dropbox folder of the ancient world, except it was made of stone and had cats living in it. Here's where it gets messy. Some ancient sources say it burned. Others say it didn't. Some say it was raided by angry mobs with torches. Others say the Christians did it later, after declaring scrolls not very Jesus approved. Others say it died slowly, scrolls decaying in silence, eaten by humidity, insects, and neglect. Basically, the building turned into a historical version of Schrodinger's cat. It was both burned and not burned until someone figures it out. Let's blame Theodosius. Kind of. Fast forward to 391, CE Emperor Theodosius. Bans pagan worship, the Serapeum, a big fat pagan temple. Boom, mobs, destruction, statues smashed, altars burned. Did they torch the scrolls? Too. Maybe. Some say the library part had already been emptied. Others say there were still thousands of scrolls inside. Philosophy, medicine, astronomy, that went up in flames with the statues. It depends on which ancient gossip column you read. Was it a warehouse? A temple? A secret library? Historians still argue. Some call it a glorified filing cabinet. Others think it was a full-blown research hub with lecture halls, scribes, and that one guy who wouldn't stop quoting Plato at lunch. The truth? It was probably a bit of everything. A temple, a storage space, a school, a sanctuary for weird, wonderful, world-changing thoughts, and possibly one of the final outposts of the Great Library's dream. And what did we maybe lose? You know, just casual stuff, like Greek tragedies no one remembers, medical journals with surgical diagrams, atlases with countries drawn upside down, poems, recipes, instructions for instruments that haven't existed since. Possibly the first real user manual for the human soul. Gone, or maybe it wasn't there at all. Maybe it was already moved. Maybe it never held that much to begin with. Welcome to the heartbreak of almost history. Why do we even care so much? Because it's the last hope. After Caesar's fire, after wars, after rulers who didn't read, this warehouse was supposed to be the emergency exit. If there was any surviving remnant of the Great Library's vision, it was probably here, and when it went down, or didn't, a part of humanity's curiosity felt it, like a light flickering in a room no one's allowed to enter anymore. So, did it burn? Honestly, we'll never know. The records are gone. The building's a ruin. The scrolls, if they ever existed there, are dust, mixed with temple rubble and very confused archaeologists. It's the kind of historical mystery that keeps scholars awake and conspiracy theorists very entertained. And the worst part? The warehouse didn't even get a proper ending. No farewell speech, no dramatic collapse, just a slow fade into historical maybe. But the legend lives because sometimes the idea of something matters more than the facts. This warehouse, real, burned, lost, or never full to begin with, became a symbol of what we could have kept, of what we might have known, of how easily knowledge slips through fingers when we're not paying attention. And that's what stings the most. Not the fire, not the ruins, but the silence that followed. Final thought before you sleep. It's comforting, in a strange way, to know that somewhere out there, maybe a quiet, dusty warehouse, once held the greatest thoughts of the ancient world. Or maybe it didn't, but it could have, and sometimes that's enough to make us dream. You're walking through Alexandria, and something feels off. The streets are louder, the temples look nervous, and you? You're clutching your scroll of herbal remedies, like it's going to protect you from whatever's coming, because it's the 4th century now, and Alexandria has turned into one giant theological boxing ring. Pagans, Christians, philosophy, faith, politics, torches, and a whole lot of very, very loud yelling. This isn't a debate anymore. This is a collision. Once upon a time, everyone kind of coexisted. Back when the great library was at its peak, Alexandria was a beautiful intellectual stew. You had Greeks reading Egyptian rituals, Romans studying Indian astronomy, philosophers arguing over the soul while standing next to priests burning incense. Sure, people disagreed, but it was a weirdly functional chaos, the kind where scrolls got written, copied, debated, and occasionally thrown across the room. And then things got religious. Enter Christianity, and it's not here to play nice. By the late 300s, Christianity wasn't just an underground movement anymore. It was official, powerful, backed by emperors and bishops with very clear opinions. And those temples, those scrolls, those dusty gods with bird heads and 8 arms, yeah, not welcome anymore. Paganism wasn't just different, it was dangerous. It was heresy. It had to go. The Serapeum, where things really went sideways. The Serapeum was once a symbol of fusion, of gods, scrolls, science, and ritual, all living under the same dome. By 391 CE, it became a battleground. Emperor Theodosius had banned pagan worship. The Christian bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, took it a step further. Time to clean house. Crowds stormed the Serapeum, smashed statues, ripped down altars, possibly set scrolls on fire, definitely yelled a lot. Pagans resisted. Christians doubled down. And in the middle of it all, the remnants of the great library may have burned. Again. Or maybe they were already gone. Either way, the screaming drowned out the thinking. What about the scholars, the scribes, the scroll huggers? Some fled, some hid, some converted or pretended to. Others stood their ground, like Hypatia, a brilliant mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, and a woman in a city that was done listening to women or scientists or women scientists. She kept teaching long after the scrolls started vanishing. She taught logic, mathematics, ethics, and in 415 CE, she was dragged from her carriage by a Christian mob and, well, history gets graphic here. Let's just say Alexandria officially closed the chapter on peaceful debate. This wasn't just religion, it was power. It's tempting to say this was all about belief, gods versus God, but really, it was about control. Who gets to decide what truth is? Who gets to say what knowledge is sacred? Who gets to burn the scroll and still sleep at night? And in Alexandria, that fight was loud, violent, unforgiving. Philosophy was no match for fury, and once the shouting started, no one could hear the ideas anymore. And the scrolls? Maybe some survived. Maybe monks hid them. Maybe they were lost in the smoke and rubble. Or maybe the last great thoughts of the ancient world were trampled by people too busy yelling to notice. It's not the neat, dramatic ending we want, but it's the one Alexandria got. History likes to point fingers. Christians burned the library. Pagans started it. Rome did it. It was just termites. Everyone wants a villain, but maybe the truth is harder. Nobody protected it. Not the emperors. Not the mobs. Not the priests or philosophers or scribes. Everyone was screaming so loudly, they forgot what the silence would cost. So what did we lose? We don't know. That's the worst part. Theories about the earth, maps of forgotten cities, plays that made Aristotle laugh, medicines that might have worked, gone, and in their place, ash and sermons. But ideas are sneaky. Here's the strange thing. You can burn a scroll. You can tear down a temple. You can silence a philosopher. But ideas? They don't die easy. Some of them snuck into monasteries. Some rode west on camels. Some hid inside the very people who once screamed. And centuries later, bit by bit, they return. Final thought. Before you sleep in a city where gods clashed and scrolls burned, the loudest voices won, but the quiet ones, the thinkers, the teachers, the people who believed knowledge mattered, they're the ones we still remember, not for the shouting, but for the whispers that somehow, miraculously, survived. You're in Alexandria. The air smells like smoke, sandalwood, and heated opinions. Everyone's shouting again. Theology, politics, astrology, pick your poison. But in the center of it all, there's one person who isn't shouting. She's quietly sketching a parabola in the dust with a stick. And everyone else in the room, bishops, senators, philosophers, is leaning in, trying to keep up. That's Hypatia, mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, teacher, and in this city of chaos and fire and broken scrolls, she's still the one people come to for answers. Who was she? Born sometime around 360 CE, Hypatia wasn't just smart, she was terrifyingly smart. Her dad, Theon, was a respected mathematician, which meant she grew up surrounded by equations, star charts, and scrolls taller than she was. Most girls were learning how to make barley cakes. Hypatia, she was solving geometric proofs before puberty. By the time she was an adult, she wasn't just teaching, she was leading. And not in a dusty back room either, in the grand halls of the city, to crowds of men twice her age. And here's the twist. They listened. She taught everyone, even if they didn't deserve it. Hypatia taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. She explained how planets move. She taught logic, ethics, why your feelings aren't facts. Her classroom was the street, the square, the steps of the Serapeum, until that got wrecked, of course. Christians, pagans, Romans, it didn't matter. They all came to her because Hypatia wasn't about religion. She was about reason. And that made her dangerous. A woman with a brain was fine until it wasn't. For a while, people respected her brilliance. But slowly, things began to shift. Christianity was now the empire's official religion, and Alexandria, once a party of mixed ideas, was turning into a battleground. Philosophers were out, bishops were in, and smart women? Not a great look anymore, especially not this woman, with her mind, her influence, her calm refusal to play politics. She didn't preach. She didn't kneel. She just thought Hypatia didn't belong to any one side. She wasn't trying to lead a rebellion. She just believed in the power of the human mind. But Alexandria had stopped trusting minds. They wanted loyalty, certainty, obedience. Hypatia? She offered questions. And in a city full of fear, that was the final straw. How she died is ugly. The year is 415 CE. Tensions are boiling. Cyril, the new bishop of Alexandria, is locking horns with the Roman governor Orestes, one of Hypatia's students. Whispers start. She's the reason Orestes won't submit. She's a pagan. She's doing witchcraft with planets. And then, one day, on her way home, she's pulled from her carriage by a Christian mob, dragged through the streets. The rest, you don't need the details. Let's just say it wasn't a trial. It wasn't justice. It was a brutal, bloody silence. Her crime? Being brilliant in public Hypatia's death wasn't just a murder. It was a message to women, to thinkers, to anyone who believed reason could challenge power. It said, "This is what happens when you ask too many questions." And Alexandria, already cracked and crumbling, felt something deep and final break. But ideas don't die. Like that, here's the twist the mob didn't count on. You can destroy a person. You can burn her papers. You can erase her from the city walls. But if she taught, if she inspired, if her ideas moved someone, then she never really disappears. Her students scattered. Her work echoed through their writings. Her name, whispered, mourned, and eventually honored, slipped into history's bloodstream. What did she actually do? Mathematically, she likely worked on commentary on Diophantus, basically ancient algebra, astronomy tools like the astrolabe, improving geometry texts that no one else even understood. But more than that, she represented something, the last breath of classical learning, the final flicker of logic in a world turning toward orthodoxy. She stood, calmly, at the edge of a collapsing era and refused to flinch. Why she still matters? Because Hypatia wasn't just a woman, or a philosopher, or a tragic end. She was a symbol of what happens when intelligence dares to exist in public. She reminded the world, even as it burned around her, that reason matters, that clarity matters, that learning isn't a luxury, it's a survival tool. And centuries later, people still say her name, still write her story, still mourn what she stood for, because the mob may have silenced her voice, but not her meaning. Final thought before you sleep. She didn't start a war. She didn't raise a flag. She didn't swing a sword. She just taught. And in the end, that was louder than anything they could burn. Sleep well, knowing this. The smartest woman in the room never really leaves. You're standing outside a temple. It's quiet, too quiet. And then a roar, chanting, feet pounding on stone. And in they come, red-faced, cross-waving, scroll-burning zealots who think Plato is witchcraft and geometry is the devil's tool. And suddenly, you just know someone's about to set something priceless on fire. Again, because when religious extremism walks into a room full of ancient scrolls, yeah, you already know how this ends. Let's set the scene. Late 4th century, Alexandria, the city, is twitchy. Pagans are being called sorcerers. Christians are arguing among themselves. Everyone thinks everyone else is wrong. And right in the middle, scrolls, thousands of them, on medicine, philosophy, astronomy, books on how to heal wounds, how to measure stars, how to calculate the weight of dreams. And to the extremists, that's not knowledge, that's blasphemy with footnotes. When reading a plus rebellion wasn't just what the scrolls said, it was that they existed. Ideas that didn't come from the Bible, heresy, proof the devil was editing textbooks, a scroll suggesting the earth might be round, clearly Satan's doing. Anything in Greek, pagan trash. Anything in Egyptian, worse. In the eyes of the extremists, knowledge wasn't sacred, it was suspicious, so they decided to cleanse it, the medieval way, with fire. The logic was flawless. If you had no brain, if God wanted us to know this stuff, they said, it'd be in the scriptures. So they burned it. Scrolls written by hand, copied over generations, saved from floods, wars, plagues, gone in seconds. Because nothing says holy enlightenment like burning a 300-year-old herbal remedy written in 5 languages. Who led the charge? It's complicated and ugly. Sometimes it was angry mobs, whipped up by sermons. Sometimes it was rogue monks with too much spare time. Sometimes it was sanctioned, quietly, by bishops who found science a little too unsettling. The line between religious fervor and political power was blurred. Scratch that. It was on fire. And the scrolls? They didn't stand a chance. The Serapeum, where the smoke got real, remember that glorious backup library? The temple that stored overflow from the great library? Well, one day, someone decided that statues of gods were offensive, and the books inside possibly possessed. The result? A cleansing that looked a lot like a riot. Stone gods shattered, altars ripped out, and thousands of scrolls, possibly the last survivors of the great library, turned into very thoughtful ash. It wasn't about faith. It was about control. The extremists weren't burning scrolls because they loved God. They were burning them because they feared doubt, because scrolls ask questions. They preserve disagreement. They whisper, what if we're wrong? And extremists, they can't afford what ifs. So they burned every maybe, every theory, every quiet, careful truth that didn't fit neatly between Genesis and Revelation. And the worst part? Most people let it happen. There were no guards at the door, no scribes throwing themselves in front of the flames. By then, the scholars were gone, the thinkers exiled, the city too exhausted to care. So the fires burned freely, and the ash piled up, and when the smoke cleared, silence, no lectures, no debates, just sermons, and the sound of lost voices echoing through empty shelves. A few brave souls tried to save what they could: a monk hiding a scroll under his robe, a student copying Aristotle from memory, a woman burying texts beneath the floorboards of a crumbling villa. Tiny acts of resistance, not enough to stop the fire, but maybe, just maybe, enough to keep the spark alive. The irony: they burned what they couldn't understand. The extremists feared the scrolls, but most of them couldn't read them. Greek, Syriac, Demotic, Coptic, Latin, too many letters, too many gods, too many ideas. So they burned them just to be safe, because nothing's scarier than a language you don't understand. Final thought before you sleep: history loves to blame fire, but scrolls don't burn themselves. They were destroyed by fear, by men so sure of their righteousness, they made ignorance holy. And yet, the ideas didn't all die. Some slipped through cracks, some hid in monasteries, some waited centuries. So sleep gently tonight, knowing this: you can burn the scrolls, but you can't kill the question. You wake up in Alexandria to the sound of a new ruler marching into town. Again, new flags, new coins, new slogans, and, without fail, one familiar line echoing through the palace halls: "We're going to fix it. It didn't matter if you were a pharaoh, a Roman, a Byzantine, or just a guy with a sword and a superiority complex. Every leader who took the throne looked at the decaying library and said, 'We'll bring it back.' And for about 5 minutes, they meant it. The library wasn't just a building, it was a dream with real estate long after the fires, long after the scholars fled, long after scrolls were used to patch roofs and line bird cages. The idea of the great library refused to die. It was too beautiful. One building, all the world's knowledge, organized, labeled, and very flammable. And every new ruler, they wanted that dream to shine on their watch, because restoring the library wasn't just about books. It was about legacy, glory, and a little something historians like to call massive ego. Ptolemies. Let's build the brain of the world. Okay, to be fair, they started the whole thing. Ptolemy I dreamt it. Ptolemy who funded it. Ptolemy III said, "Let's steal scrolls from every ship in the harbor." It was peak intellectual ambition, until things started catching fire. But even after that, later, Ptolemy still walked around muttering, "We'll fix it," as if knowledge could be replanted like basil. Spoiler: they mostly just added walls and hired angry scribes. Romans, let's make Alexandria great again. Enter Rome. They loved order, bureaucracy, infrastructure. And when Julius Caesar accidentally lit part of the city on fire, well, oops. But future Roman emperors looked at the ruins and said, "We'll fix it." They restored parts of the Mausion, reopened learning centers, even paid scholars in grain. For a while, it worked. Then more fires, more wars, more scrolls mysteriously used as kindling. Byzantines. What if theology, but with less books? The Byzantines inherited Alexandria, and, surprise, they also wanted to fix it, but this time with a catch. No pagan stuff, no weird math, only theology, please. So, they brought scrolls back. Some of them. They rebuilt classrooms, sort of. They invited scholars, the right kind. Imagine trying to rebuild a world class library, but refusing half the alphabet. The result? A library in theory and a bonfire in practice. Caliph Omar, maybe. If it's in the Quran, we don't need it. There's a famous, possibly fake, story about when Muslim forces took Alexandria. Someone allegedly asked Caliph Omar what to do with the remaining scrolls. And the answer? If the books agree with the Quran, we don't need them. If they don't, we definitely don't need them. So the scrolls were burned. Used to heat bathhouses for months. Did it happen? Historians argue. But the point remains, even when rulers promised to preserve knowledge, they often meant filtered knowledge. What they meant was, let's rebuild the idea of the library, not the real thing. The real library, with its messy cataloging, weird scrolls about fish diseases, and 400-year-old maps drawn by people who'd never seen a coastline. That was gone. What remained was a myth, and myths are much easier to fix. Just build a fancy building, hang a quote from Plato, invite some scholars, call it the new library. Boom. Fixed, right? But the problem was never just the walls, it was the thinking, the endless curiosity, the arguments, the copying and recopying of scrolls, even when they were boring, the belief that no idea was too small, too foreign, or too weird to be written down. You can rebuild stone. You can even restock scrolls. But you can't just summon that kind of intellectual chaos out of nowhere. It's not a renovation, it's a culture. And by the time most rulers realized that, they'd either been overthrown or they were using library shelves to store tax records. Each ruler made a promise, most just made a mess. There were attempts, real ones, small study halls, translations, scribes hunched over desks by candlelight, tiny flames in the darkness. But they weren't rebuilding the library, they were clinging to its shadow, because once a dream burns, scroll by scroll, scholar by scholar, you can't rebuild it with speeches. You rebuild it with patience. And nobody had time for that. Final thought before you sleep. The library didn't die in one fire. It died in 1,000 broken promises. Each ruler who said, "We'll fix it," meant well. But they were fixing a dream with bricks and scrolls, when what it really needed was courage to think freely, to preserve everything, to listen to the weird, the brilliant, the uncomfortable. So sleep now, and if you ever wake up in charge of something precious, please don't just say, "We'll fix it." Actually mean it. You're asleep, probably dreaming about bread, stars, or scrolls. And then the floor moves, not like a creak, not like a breeze, like the entire earth just changed its mind. Stone shifts, jars rattle, and somewhere, deep inside Alexandria's already bruised ruins, something very old and very wise crumbles. Because if war and fire hadn't finished the library story, Mother Nature decided to sign her name at the bottom. Earthquakes in Alexandria? Oh, yes. and they were not polite. Alexandria sat right along the edge of tectonic drama, near the eastern Mediterranean, a region where the ground likes to shimmy every few decades. And ancient buildings? Yeah, they weren't built for shimmying. Stone, columns, heavy archways, scroll-lined walls with zero structural flexibility. When the earth shook, everything ancient got nervous. And libraries? They got flattened. First, the roof caves in, then the silence. Imagine a scholar hunched over a table, translating Aristotle, a scribe organizing scrolls alphabetically, grumbling about the lack of vowels. Then, crack, walls shift, shelves tip, scrolls fall like leaves in a very tragic autumn. It's loud, then it's quiet, then it's gone. Not because someone set a fire, not because an army invaded, just because the ground had an opinion. Stone versus scroll. Guess who loses? Scrolls are dramatic little things. They hate humidity. They hate rats. They really hate being crushed by falling marble. No preservation technique in the ancient world included getting buried under half a temple. So, when earthquakes hit Alexandria, and they did more than once, the scrolls suffered quietly, crushed, ripped, buried, forgotten, and unlike fire, earthquakes didn't announce themselves with warning smoke. They just showed up and started. Breaking history. Let's rebuild, they said. Then the ground moved again. Every time the city tried to rise back up, the ground gently reminded everyone, nope. Temples were patched, columns reinforced, scholars tiptoed back into half-standing libraries. But then, another tremor, another collapse, more crushed wisdom. By the time anyone thought about rebuilding again, they were either broke, invaded, or too busy trying not to get swallowed by the next aftershock. It wasn't personal. It was just physics. The earth doesn't hate books. It doesn't wake up and think, today, I'll destroy 10,000 years of medical theory. It just shifts, as it always has, and always will. But in a world where most scrolls existed in exactly one fragile, flammable, brittle copy, a single crack in the wall could erase an entire civilization's memory. And unfortunately, cracks were Alexandria's specialty. So, how many scrolls did earthquakes actually destroy? No one knows. There's no ancient librarian report that says, inventory update, lost 42 poems, 8-star charts, and one very sarcastic play. But we do know that multiple earthquakes rocked the city between the 4th and 10th centuries. And each time, buildings fell, libraries took damage, and no one had the resources or energy to start over. After a while, people stopped even trying. Add salt water, sand, and time, and you've got a recipe for disappearance. The Nile shifted. The sea crept in. Dust settled. Floods came. Scrolls disintegrated. Books aren't like bones. They don't fossilize. They vanish. Quietly. Completely. You don't find their bodies. Just the space they should have been. And in Alexandria, the space got bigger every year. It wasn't just the end of a library. It was the end of a culture of curiosity. When scrolls fell, so did the need to ask questions. When buildings collapsed, so did the courage to rebuild them. When nature screamed, humans got quiet. Because you can resist an invading army. You can even fight off a mob. But the earth, you just hope it doesn't roll over again. So was that it? The final blow? Maybe. No fires, no screaming, no mobs, just the ground shifting beneath a crumbling city and a few forgotten scrolls buried beneath it forever. The kind of ending that doesn't make headlines, the kind that sneaks in, the kind that wins. Final thought before you sleep. Not every library dies in flames. Some just sink into the earth, into the silence, into the place where memory and dust sleep side by side. So next time the ground feels still beneath you, be grateful. Somewhere, a scroll never had that chance. You've heard the story. Everyone has. Muslim conquerors arrive in Alexandria. They see what's left of the once mighty library. Someone gasps. Someone begs for mercy. Spare the scrolls. A soldier shrugs. A commander sends word to Caliph Omar. And the message comes back. If the books agree with the Quran, we don't need them. If they disagree, we definitely don't need them. So the scrolls were tossed into bathhouse furnaces, burned for fuel, used to heat water for months. Sounds dramatic. Sounds devastating. Sounds a little too perfect. Let's talk about it. First of all, that quote is almost certainly fake. Let's start with the famous line attributed to Caliph Omar, the one about the books agreeing or disagreeing with the Quran. It first shows up in writing hundreds of years after the event supposedly happened. First, the roof caves in, then the silence. Imagine a scholar hunched over a table, translating Aristotle, a scribe organizing scrolls alphabetically, grumbling about the lack of vowels. Then, crack, walls shift, shelves tip, scrolls fall like leaves in a very tragic autumn. It's loud, then it's quiet, then it's gone. Not because someone set a fire, not because an army invaded, just because the ground had an opinion. Stone versus scroll. Guess who loses? Scrolls are dramatic little things. They hate humidity. They hate rats. They really hate being crushed by falling marble. No preservation technique in the ancient world included getting buried under half a temple. So, when earthquakes hit Alexandria, and they did more than once, the scrolls suffered quietly, crushed, ripped, buried, forgotten, and unlike fire, earthquakes didn't announce themselves with warning smoke. They just showed up and started. Breaking history. Let's rebuild, they said. Then the ground moved again. Every time the city tried to rise back up, the ground gently reminded everyone, nope. Temples were patched, columns reinforced, scholars tiptoed back into half-standing libraries. But then, another tremor, another collapse, more crushed wisdom. By the time anyone thought about rebuilding again, they were either broke, invaded, or too busy trying not to get swallowed by the next aftershock. It wasn't personal. It was just physics. The earth doesn't hate books. It doesn't wake up and think, today, I'll destroy 10,000 years of medical theory. It just shifts, as it always has, and always will. But in a world where most scrolls existed in exactly one fragile, flammable, brittle copy, a single crack in the wall could erase an entire civilization's memory. And unfortunately, cracks were Alexandria's specialty. So, how many scrolls, did earthquakes actually destroy? No one knows. There's no ancient librarian report that says, inventory update, lost 42 poems, 8-star charts, and one very sarcastic play. But we do know that multiple earthquakes rocked the city between the 4th and 10th centuries. And each time, buildings fell, libraries took damage, and no one had the resources or energy to start over. After a while, people stopped even trying. Add salt water, sand, and time, and you've got a recipe for disappearance. The Nile shifted. The sea crept in. Dust settled. Floods came. Scrolls disintegrated. Books aren't like bones. They don't fossilize. They vanish. Quietly. Completely. You don't find their bodies. Just the space they should have been. And in Alexandria, the space got bigger every year. It wasn't just the end of a library. It was the end of a culture of curiosity. When scrolls fell, so did the need to ask questions. When buildings collapsed, so did the courage to rebuild them. When nature screamed, humans got quiet. Because you can resist an invading army. You can even fight off a mob. But the earth, you just hope it doesn't roll over again. So was that it? The final blow? Maybe. No fires, no screaming, no mobs, just the ground shifting beneath a crumbling city and a few forgotten scrolls buried beneath it forever. The kind of ending that doesn't make headlines, the kind that sneaks in, the kind that wins. Final thought before you sleep. Not every library dies in flames. Some just sink into the earth, into the silence, into the place where memory and dust sleep side by side. So next time the ground feels still beneath you, be grateful. Somewhere, a scroll never had that chance. You've heard the story. Everyone has. Muslim conquerors arrive in Alexandria. They see what's left of the once mighty library. Someone gasps. Someone begs for mercy. Spare the scrolls. A soldier shrugs. A commander sends word to Caliph Omar. And the message comes back. If the books agree with the Quran, we don't need them. If they disagree, we definitely don't need them. So the scrolls were tossed into bathhouse furnaces, burned for fuel, used to heat water for months. Sounds dramatic. Sounds devastating. Sounds a little too perfect. Let's talk about it. First of all, that quote is almost certainly fake. Let's start with the famous line attributed to Caliph Omar, the one about the books agreeing or disagreeing with the Quran. It first shows up in writing hundreds of years after the event supposedly happened. The source? A Christian bishop with an axe to grind and a flair for historical drama. So, maybe not the most reliable narrator. No contemporary Muslim, Christian, or scribe from that time period mentions the burning, which is a little odd considering this would have been the biggest bonfire of knowledge in history. Historians today, most of them roll their eyes and say, yeah, probably didn't happen. So, what did happen in 642 CE? Muslim armies, led by Amr ibn al-As, conquered Egypt, including Alexandria. And yes, they took over a city that had once been the beating heart of global scholarship. But by then, the great library was already long gone, burned, looted, earthquaked, eaten by time, neglect, and religious purges from earlier centuries. Whatever remained was either scraps in private homes or faded scrolls in forgotten storage rooms. In other words, there wasn't much left to burn. So, where did this myth come from? Most likely, it was a story made after the fact, a way for later writers to explain a tragedy they couldn't fully trace. Who burned the library became a historical hot potato. Everyone blamed someone else. Caesar? Sure, but that was early. Christian mobs? Definitely played a role. Theodosius's crackdown on pagan temples? Yep. Earthquakes? Absolutely. But Muslims, they showed up centuries into the disaster. And by then, the library wasn't a glowing beacon of wisdom. It was a shadow of itself. Also, Muslims loved books. Like, a lot. This part matters. Early Islamic civilization was obsessed with learning. They translated Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, Indian math, Roman medicine, all of it. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, basically the sequel to Alexandria, but with better calligraphy and less arson. So why would the same culture that preserved Aristotle, developed algebra, and cataloged ancient science burn it all in Alexandria? They wouldn't. It goes against everything they were doing at the time. If anything, they tried to save what was left. Amr ibn al-As wasn't some brainless conqueror. He was known for being diplomatic, even cautious. There's evidence his administration repurposed temples into mosques, protected scholars, and even absorbed some remaining scrolls into Islamic collections. If there were any survivors from the library's golden age, they were probably stashed, scattered, or already ruined. Muslims didn't destroy the library. They likely showed up to find its grave. So why does this story keep getting told? Because it's clean, and blame is comforting. A single villain, a single fire, a clear ending. It's easier than facing the messier truth. The Library of Alexandria wasn't lost in one night. It died slowly through carelessness, politics, ego, religious extremism, nature, and time. Saying the Muslims burned it is like walking into the ruins of a house that burned down 100 years ago and blaming the new tenant for the missing roof. So, case closed? Well, historians will keep debating. That's their job. But the overwhelming consensus is the Muslim conquest didn't burn the library. It buried what was already ashes. If anything, they were too late to do real damage because the damage had been done by everyone before them. Final thought. Before you sleep, the truth isn't always simple. But in this case, it's strangely hopeful because the culture that got blamed for burning knowledge actually spent centuries saving it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part of the story we should remember. You're looking at a map of ancient Alexandria, tracing your finger toward the Great Library, expecting a giant red X, but instead, you get 5 maybes, 3 question marks, and a vague suggestion near a temple that no longer exists. Because here's the thing no one tells you the Library of Alexandria wasn't just one place, it was a network, a concept, a collection of buildings, scrolls, and frustrated scholars spread across a city that couldn't stop reorganizing itself, which makes pinning down what burned and when a bit like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle after someone's eaten half the pieces. Let's start with what people think they mean. When someone says the Library of Alexandria, they usually imagine one massive, marble domed building filled with scrolls, golden globes, and people whispering about Aristotle over wine. That place, it's real in spirit, and extremely blurry, in fact, because the truth is, the library was a complex, not a single room, with a librarian and a shh sign. It was woven into the Mouseion, the ancient research institute, kind of like a university, think tank, library, and philosophy cult, all rolled into one, with less coffee and more goat references. So where was it? Great question. Some scholars think the main library was inside the Mouseion near the royal palace, but others argue it was a separate structure, somewhere nearby, possibly connected by fancy walkways or at least by shared scroll gossip. And then there's the Serapeum, a massive temple that doubled as a backup library when the original started overflowing. Some say it became the main library after Caesar's accidental bonfire in the harbor. Others say it was always a secondary scroll closet, and then, surprise, a few historians think there may have been even more locations, hidden archives, study halls, warehouses full of duplicate scrolls waiting for someone to alphabetize them. Alexandria might have been less one library and more city sized knowledge sponge. Why does this matter? Because it breaks the myth you can't blame one fire for destroying the library if there were 4 or 5 of them, and you can't say the Muslims burned it, or the Christians wrecked it, or Julius slipped and dropped a torch if no one agrees on which part of the library they're even talking about. The Library of Alexandria wasn't a single building that vanished overnight. It was an idea with multiple mailing addresses, and each address met its end, slowly, painfully, and with varying degrees of trauma. Also, it was always evolving. One ruler would expand it, another would cut funding, a new religion would censor it, an earthquake would casually drop a ceiling, scrolls would get moved, reorganized, forgotten, rediscovered. So by the time someone tried to restore the library, they weren't rebuilding a single building. They were trying to resurrect an entire lost ecosystem of scholarship. Good luck with that. Most of what we know comes from people who never saw it. No blueprints, no floor plans, just ancient writers arguing. Some describe high ceilings and vast courtyards. Others mention scrolls stacked in crates or in dusty annexes beside temples. A few even wrote about their visits, but somehow didn't include a map, a sketch, or any helpful directions. Thanks, guys. So what burned? Depends on who you ask. Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, maybe the warehouse by the harbor, Christian mob in 391 CE, likely the Serapeum, later earthquakes, probably anything still standing, time, neglect, and humidity, the rest. It wasn't one catastrophe. It was a slow motion collapse across centuries, hitting different locations like dominoes falling across a sand covered city. And that's why it hurts more. Because the tragedy wasn't a single explosion, it was a long, slow forgetting. One scroll lost to fire, another to mold, another tossed aside because a new emperor decided Plato was overrated. The idea of a single, central library burning in one final act. That's dramatic, but the reality that it was everywhere and vanished piece by piece. That's worse, because we didn't just lose a place, we lost an entire culture of remembering. Final thought before you sleep, the library wasn't one room, it was 1,000 shelves scattered across a dreaming city. It didn't die all at once, it died in whispers, a scroll here, a collapse there, and yet its ghost still lingers. Because even if the buildings are gone, the idea remains that somewhere all our knowledge could live in one place, even if no one agrees where that place ever was. You're sitting in a quiet, candle-lit room, not your room, a room 2,000 years ago. There's a scroll in your hand. It smells like papyrus and ink. The handwriting is delicate. The ideas, terrifyingly smart. And just as you're starting to understand it, someone lights a torch. Someone else drops a ceiling. Or maybe the earth yawns and swallows the floor whole. That scroll, gone, not just burned, forgotten. Welcome to the real heartbreak of the great library. We don't know exactly what we lost, but we know it was everything. Let's start with the stars. The library held some of the oldest, most precise star charts in existence, from Babylonian calculations to Egyptian astrology to early Greek theories that would later become the backbone of astronomy. You know how we figured out the Earth was round? They knew that, and they had math to prove it. When 700 years before, Columbus packed his boat full of bad maps and hope. Some scrolls probably recorded comets, eclipses, planetary motion, all charted by people who didn't even have telescopes. All of that drifted into smoke. You like poetry? Yeah, that too. The library wasn't just for science nerds. It was a home for art. Poets from all over the world, women, men, mythmakers, outcasts, sent their work to Alexandria. They wrote about love, about war, about olives and the moon, and unrequited heartbreak, with absolutely no punctuation. We have fragments, lines, scraps, but entire bodies of work vanished. Gone are the stories of the ancient world that never made it into school curriculums. Gone are the voices we never got to hear sing. Histories. Pfft, you should have seen what we had. You've heard of Herodotus, maybe Thucydides, but there were hundreds, maybe thousands, of historians writing about their cities, their people, their strange little kingdoms, where the cows were sacred and the rivers ran backward in winter. They described battles no one else remembered, kings whose names we never learned, inventions that were centuries too early to be believed. There could have been an entire scroll explaining how the pyramids were built. We'll never know, because someone used it to heat a bath. Science, medicine, and other useful things, like brain surgery. Let's be very clear. Ancient people weren't stupid. Alexandria preserved texts on anatomy, surgery, herbal medicine, even early psychiatric care. They were experimenting with opium, antiseptics, prosthetics, and probably very questionable toothpaste. There might have been a scroll that said, "Here's how not to die from an infection when your leg falls off." But someone decided it wasn't Christian enough, or Roman enough, or they just needed a scroll to stuff in a leaking roof. And that knowledge? Gone. Philosophy? There were whole schools that no longer exist. We remember the big names: Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, but they weren't the only ones. There were dozens of schools of thought, some mystical, some practical, some completely unhinged, whose entire doctrines vanished when the shelves fell. What did they believe? Hard to say. Maybe they cracked the ethics of artificial intelligence before we even figured out what a toaster was. We'll never know, because every copy of their teachings burned, and all we have are confused footnotes from people who once argued with them, religions you've never heard of. Yeah, we lost those to imagine belief systems that blended stars, animals, numbers, dreams, religions where silence was worship, or where music was the highest form of prayer. Some of these belief systems were recorded in Alexandria, debated, compared, and now gone, not suppressed, not discredited, just lost, like they were never even real. And then there's Atlantis. Yes, that Atlantis. Plato wrote about it, sure. But what if someone, an explorer, a philosopher, a slightly tipsy merchant, found something? What if there were maps, travel logs, even crude diagrams showing a sunken island that nobody took seriously? They might have sent those notes to Alexandria, and someone might have filed them under crazy but fun, and they might have burned with everything else, which means we might have lost the proof of Atlantis, or we lost a very committed fan fiction writer's dream project. Either way, we'll never know. It wasn't just information, it was memory. Everything humanity had learned, everything we were trying to understand, had been copied, translated, stacked, and shelved in Alexandria. And over the years, piece by piece, we forgot not just facts, but questions, ideas. We didn't even know how to ask anymore. The worst part? Some of those scrolls might have explained how to stop this exact kind of forgetting from happening. Too late. Final thought. Before you sleep, people say knowledge is power. But at Alexandria, knowledge was hope, proof that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. And when the library crumbled, so did a part of our human story. So sleep gently tonight, knowing this. We don't have their maps, but we still have their stars. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find our way back. You're trying to read by candlelight. The wax is melting. Your fingers are smudged with ink, and the papyrus in your lap, extremely flammable. Behind you, a scholar sneezes too close to a torch. To your left, someone's boiling water for medicinal wine. Next to a stack of scrolls that definitely smell like dry hay. And you start to realize something. The great library wasn't just a beacon of knowledge. It was basically a bonfire waiting for an excuse. Let's talk materials. What were these scrolls made of? Not fireproof, that's for sure. Most scrolls in Alexandria were made from papyrus, a plant-based writing material that's about as flame-friendly as dry autumn leaves. Smooth, fragile, dry, basically perfect kindling. Ink, organic, sometimes made from soot. Bindings, often cloth or leather. Shelves, wood. In short, the whole system was less a library and more a beautifully arranged fire hazard. Lighting? No electricity. Just danger. There were no LEDs. No soft glow desk lamps. If you wanted light, you used oil lamps with open flames inside stone buildings. surrounded by scrolls. Oh, and ventilation, not really a thing. So what you got was a warm, smoky, dry room filled with gasping scribes, unstable lamps, and walls lined with centuries of highly flammable history. The copyists, tired, clumsy, and flammable scrolls, didn't write themselves. Copyists, those underpaid, overworked heroes, spent hours hunched over wooden desks, squinting at ancient handwriting and muttering about poor punctuation. Sometimes they wore wool. Sometimes they used wax tablets. Sometimes they worked 16-hour shifts by lamplight. And sometimes they knocked over a candle, or forgot to snuff their flame, or dropped a scroll into a brazier while reaching for tea. No evil empire, no invading army, just Steve, the sleepy scribe with butterfingers. The library wasn't a room, it was a matchbox, and it wasn't just one room. There were warehouses full of scrolls, storage temples, reading halls with lamps flickering in every corner. Some estimates say the Great Library, in its prime, had up to 400,000 scrolls. That's 400,000 paper fuses. And with no fire department, no fireproof walls, and zero fire escapes, one spark. See you never. Philosophy department. Historical fireproofing techniques. Laughably, bad did they try to protect the scrolls? Sure, kinda. In theory, they sometimes stored texts in clay jars or stone niches. Some wealthier collections used bronze boxes, but most scrolls, they were piled on wooden shelves, hung in bundles, or stacked like laundry in dusty rooms. And in the dry Alexandria air, after a hot day and a heated theological debate, all it took was a stray ember and a breeze. Poof. You want specific disasters? We got 'em Caesar's fire. Started at the docks, jumped to the warehouses. Scrolls caught like dry leaves in a campfire. Later blazes. Probably caused by war, sure, but just as likely by a clumsy monk knocking over a lantern. The Serapeum, temple incense, plus angry mobs, plus scrolls stored inside chapels. You do the math. And we haven't even talked about accidental fires started by lightning, kitchen stoves, or someone trying to make tea near Plato's collected works. So why not just stop using fire? Because they had no choice. Fire was warmth. Fire was light. Fire was ritual. And fire was dangerously normal. Nobody walked into the library thinking, maybe we should invent flame retardant papyrus. They were just trying to finish a translation of Aristotle before sunset. And by the time they smelled smoke, too late. The real tragedy? Everyone knew it could happen. Scholars knew how fragile everything was. There were even ancient warnings. Protect scrolls, guard archives, keep fire away. But warnings don't stop time. And over centuries, with changing rulers, shifting priorities, and tired hands, someone slipped, someone yawned, someone lit a lamp a little too close, and another piece of the ancient world drifted away in smoke. Final thought before you sleep. The Great Library wasn't just lost to conquerors or crusades. Sometimes it was lost to accidents, a flame, a breeze, a tired hand. Because when the light you need to read is also the thing that destroys what you're reading, it's only a matter of time. So sleep softly, and maybe blow out that candle. First, you're a scholar in Alexandria. You just watched a scroll, a hand-copied, 4 generations old medical text on how to stop blood loss with goat milk and pomegranate juice. Go up in flames. You're crying, not sobbing, not screaming, just that quiet kind of heartbreak only people who've spent 30 years translating one sentence understand. And outside, a politician is sipping watered down wine, shrugging and mumbling something like, can't be helped. Because the truth is, while the thinkers were mourning, the rest of the world just kept going. A few old books. We've got bigger problems. To most rulers, scrolls weren't sacred. They were nice to have. Luxury items. Status. Symbols. Good for showing off at parties. But in a time of invasions, power struggles, and plagues that could wipe out half your dinner party, preserving a 900-line poem about river gods didn't exactly feel urgent. So when a fire broke out, when a temple fell, when a mob broke through the library doors, politicians didn't weep. They rebuilt the walls, repainted the statues, maybe offered a vague speech, and then they moved on. Scholars, on the other hand, were having a full existential breakdown because for them, those scrolls weren't just information. They were memory, legacy, work. Some had spent decades copying a single text. Others had traveled across deserts to bring one scroll home. Some had risked their lives to translate a medical formula from a language no one else even spoke anymore. And now, gone, not stolen, not censored, just incinerated, like it never existed. Imagine losing your life's work, then realizing the guy in charge only cares if the walls are still standing. Civilization has a short attention span. The library burned. Tragic. But Rome was still expanding. Grain still needed to be shipped. Taxes still needed collecting. Philosophy was nice, but feeding people, fighting wars, and writing your name bigger than your father's on a building, that was progress. Knowledge didn't fit in the budget, not when temples needed rebuilding, and someone just declared himself emperor again. We'll rebuild it. No, they wouldn't. Every time a piece of Alexandria's knowledge was lost, someone in power probably said, we'll rebuild it. But scrolls aren't bricks. You can't just slap another one together. You need scribes, translators, memory. You need care. And rulers didn't have time for that. They had revolts to crush, borders to defend, statues to commission. So the rebuilding mostly never happened, at least not in a way that counted. Ideas died, but not loudly. No one carved into stone. Today, we lost the only known cure for a disease we won't rediscover until 1856. They just moved on. And that's the part that haunts you. Because the world didn't collapse when the library did. It just got quieter, dumber, narrower, and nobody noticed until centuries later when we looked back and saw how much light we'd lost. Some knowledge lingered, but most didn't. A few scrolls were saved, a few ideas smuggled east, west, copied by monks in cold monasteries who didn't even know what they were copying. But a lot just vanished. Gone were the star charts that could have guided ships. Gone were the calculations that could have prevented diseases. Gone were the poems, the voices, the questions that might have saved us from repeating ourselves. We didn't lose history. We lost what could have been next. And the politicians? They got statues, while the scholars faded into footnotes. The leaders, who shrugged, got monuments, triumphal arches, engraved pillars, gold coins with very serious noses. No one wrote down how many scrolls burned on their watch, but you can still find their names, big, bold, and completely unaware that they presided over the slow collapse of something irreplaceable. The saddest part, we keep doing it modern day. Different scrolls, same shrug, libraries defunded, research dismissed, truths buried under noise. We tell ourselves the world is too busy for old ideas. We forget that old ideas are what hold the world together until they're gone, and suddenly we're staring into the same silence the Alexandrians left behind. Final thought before you sleep. Not every tragedy is a battle. Some are just neglect. Scholars cried, politicians shrugged, and civilization, unaware of what it had lost, simply walked forward into the dark. So tonight, if you hold knowledge in your hands, a book, a thought, a question, protect it, because someone more powerful probably won't. You're strolling through Alexandria, centuries after the fires, the mobs, the scroll-murdering earthquakes. The streets are still busy. The markets still smell like fish and figs. The harbor still hums with trade. But something's missing. Not the buildings. Not the noise. Not even the temples. What's gone is harder to see. It's the thinking, because Alexandria kept existing, just without the brains. The shell was still there. The city didn't vanish after the library fell apart. It didn't sink. It didn't get erased from maps. It still had palaces. It still had priests. It still had people who liked yelling about taxes in the forum. But the scrolls were gone. The scholars were gone. The glow, that strange electric feeling that comes from too many smart people arguing in the same room, gone. It became a capital without a compass. At its peak, Alexandria was the mind of the world. Ideas from India, Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, all passed through its scroll-lined halls. It didn't just store knowledge, it produced it. But after the knowledge disappeared, the city became just another port. Important, sure, but replaceable, like a smartphone without apps. It still functioned, but it didn't do the cool stuff anymore. The buildings outlived the brilliance. The Mausyon collapsed or repurposed. The Serapeum looted, burned, converted. The scholars exiled, killed, forgotten, or worse, replaced by bureaucrats who thought math was unsettling. But the city kept marching on. Weddings, riots, grain shipments, just less Aristotle, less astronomy, less asking, what if we're wrong? Tourists still came, just not the kind who asked questions. Later, travelers would still visit Alexandria. They'd admire the pillars, stare at the lighthouse, buy souvenirs, but they weren't there for the thinking. They didn't ask, where were the scrolls kept? They asked, where can I find lunch? It wasn't a place to learn anymore. It was a place to remember. Learning had once happened there, which is kind of like standing in a burned-down theater and clapping anyway. The worst part? Nobody noticed it happened. There was no dramatic final scroll, no scholar standing in the rubble saying, "This is the end of knowledge as we know it." Nope. The silence came slowly, day by day, shelf by shelf, until one day Alexandria was just a city, a pretty one, a busy one, but not that city, not the city where people invented the future, just another stop along the way to somewhere else. Some people tried to bring the magic back later, rulers, Muslims, Christians, Byzantines. They all tried, in their own way. They opened schools, built archives, invited thinkers, but it was like planting one rose and hoping it would grow into a jungle overnight, without the scholars, without the scrolls, without the messy, electric chaos of ideas colliding. It just wasn't the same. Civilization moved on. Alexandria just stayed there as Baghdad rose, as European universities appeared, as the Renaissance crept toward the horizon. Alexandria watched, not in bitterness, not even in confusion, just in stillness. Because a city without its thinkers isn't dead. It's just paused. A lighthouse with the bulb removed, still standing, still tall, just no longer guiding anyone. But its ghost still walks, the halls even. Now, when you visit the ruins, you can feel it, not sadness, just unfinished sentences, whispers of what might have been, a fragment of a poem, a lost theorem, a half-translated cure for something we still don't understand. The brains may be gone, but the questions still echo in the walls. Final thought before you sleep. Alexandria survived its own forgetting. The stones stayed, the streets stayed, the name stayed. But names aren't enough, because what matters most in a city isn't how long it stands. It's what it thinks about while it's standing. And for a brief, blinding moment, Alexandria thought about everything. Then it stopped. So sleep gently tonight, and maybe dream of a place where thought still matters more than walls. You're sitting in a modern university lecture hall. The chairs are plastic, the coffee's bad, and the professor is waving their arms and saying something like, "Caesar started it." From the back, someone coughs. Actually, it was the Christians. Then another voice. It was the Muslims. Then someone near the window, sipping a lukewarm latte, mutters, "Technically, it was the termites." Welcome to the most ancient debate that still won't shut up. What actually happened to the Library of Alexandria? And the answer is, nobody knows. But that doesn't stop us from yelling about it. Everyone wants a villain, preferably a famous one. If you've got an enemy you don't like, boom, just say they burned the library. Romans, blame Caesar. Christians, blame Theophilus and the mob. Muslims, blame Caliph Omar. Climate change? Let's not, but give it a few more years, and someone will try. Because the library's destruction is history's favorite blank canvas for outrage. It's too big, too tragic, too mysterious, and mystery. It makes people invent answers. The one big fire. Theory, very cinematic, very wrong. People love the idea of a single apocalyptic event. One night, one spark, one poet screaming, "No!" as scrolls fall like flaming snow. But in reality, it was probably a long, slow train wreck. A mix of fire, politics, earthquakes, religious violence, budget cuts, and good old-fashioned human laziness. Kind of like if your house burned down but over 300 years and everyone blamed the last guy. To light a candle, Caesar's fire, 48 BCE. The accidental arsonist, yes. Julius Caesar did start a fire during his siege of Alexandria. Yes, the docks burned. Yes, storage buildings full of scrolls likely caught flame. Yes, he probably didn't lose sleep over it. But was it the fire? Unclear. Some historians think it was just the scroll warehouse. Others say the main library was untouched. Some say it sparked the slow unraveling. So, definitely maybe the Christian mob. 391 CE. Theology meets torchlight. When Emperor Theodosius banned pagan worship, the Serapeum, the backup library, became a target. Christians tore down statues, burned what they found, declared anything pagan as dangerous, heretical, or just tacky. Were there scrolls inside? Maybe. Was it a deliberate attempt to erase knowledge? Maybe not. But when the smoke cleared, another chunk of Alexandria's mind was missing. The Muslim conquest, 642 CE. The bathhouse allegation. This one's juicy. The story goes that Caliph Omar ordered the remaining scrolls burned to heat the city's bathhouses because anything not in the Quran was either redundant or forbidden. The problem, that story shows up centuries later, written by people with an agenda. And most historians today, they call it a myth, a smear, a historical fan fiction. By the time the Muslims arrived, the library was already a ghost. Don't forget nature. It was also a jerk. Alexandria got hit with earthquakes, floods, soil erosion, and a location that was basically saying, please knock me over. Scrolls don't do well with water, or shaking, or sand. So even without mobs or generals or holy men, time itself was slowly erasing the ink. And then there's bureaucracy, the silent killer. One ruler disbanded the scholars. Another cut the budget. Another moved the scrolls to a temple that got looted 3 decades later. There wasn't a final villain. There were dozens of them, each one just a little too careless, a little too busy, a little too eager to say, we'll fix it later. Spoiler, they didn't. Modern scholars still can't agree, you'd think. With satellites and degrees and fancy archives, we'd have a consensus. Nope, they argue at conferences. They publish conflicting books. They throw politely worded shade in footnotes. Some say the library died with Caesar. Some say it lived until the 7th century. Some say the scrolls were moved and lost in dozens of smaller tragedies, and all of them are probably a little bit right and a lot frustrated. And honestly, we're all arguing about a symbol, because the Library of Alexandria wasn't just a place. It was an idea of human knowledge in one spot, of curiosity without borders, of thought being more powerful than fire, and when something that big disappears, people will always want to know who to blame, even if the answer is just us. Final thought. Before you sleep, the library didn't die once. It died in chapters, burned, buried, banned, and forgotten. And now we argue, we guess, we mourn, because even if we never agree on how it ended, we all feel what was lost. So rest tonight not with answers, but with the questions, because that's the most ancient tradition of all. You're standing in Alexandria, not during the glory days, but sometime after the scrolls stopped arriving, after the scholars stopped writing, after the last fragile stack of knowledge went up in smoke or dust or silence. The buildings are still there, sort of, but the soul of the city, it's missing. And even if no one says it out loud, everyone feels it. Because when the greatest library in the world disappears, it's not just books that burn. Something deeper goes with it. It wasn't just a place, it was a promise. The Library of Alexandria stood for something ridiculous and beautiful. That everything, every poem, every theory, every language, every question could live in one place. It was the idea that knowledge wasn't just power, it was worth collecting, protecting, cherishing. And when that burned, so did the idea that humanity could actually be wise, not just clever, not just loud, but wise. Hope isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a shelf filled with scrolls, is quiet. It doesn't shout, it doesn't conquer, it just waits for someone curious enough to open it. That was the magic. Alexandria whispered to the world, "Come, ask anything." And for a while, the world answered. But when the flames came, when the scrolls curled and cracked and vanished, the whisper stopped, and the silence that followed wasn't just sad, it was hopeless, because the people who needed that knowledge never got it. How many cures? Lost. How many maps? Gone. How many questions that might have stopped wars or saved lives or sparked new galaxies of thought? We don't know. And that's the part that hurts. Not just what we lost, but what we never got to learn. And the tragedy wasn't just that. It burned. It's that no one rebuilt. It's sure. Rulers said they would. They rebuilt the walls, repurposed the halls, made speeches with very official sounding Latin. But the spark was gone. The scholars didn't return. The scrolls didn't grow back. And slowly, painfully, people stopped expecting them to. The world moved on, with less wonder, and no one seemed to notice. The real loss, the culture that believed knowledge mattered more than ego Alexandria, wasn't perfect, but it believed in something rare, that asking questions was more sacred than winning arguments, that copying a scroll could be as heroic as wielding a sword, that truth, however inconvenient, was still worth preserving. When the library burned, that belief cracked, and in its place came louder things: empires, doctrines, noise. Hope doesn't always die with a scream. Sometimes it just stops showing up. There were no funerals for the scrolls, no national days of mourning, just fewer questions, fewer translations, fewer children growing up, dreaming about stars and scrolls and the mysteries of the universe. Hope didn't explode, it just dimmed, and maybe that's why we keep telling this story. We need the library to mean something, because if even Alexandria, the brightest brain of the ancient world, could be destroyed, what chance do the rest of us have? So we tell it again, and again, and again, hoping that someone, somewhere, will hear the warning, or feel the spark, or pick up a book and whisper, "Let's try again." Final thought. Before you sleep, The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building, it was humanity's best version of itself, curious, humble, brave. And when it burned, so did our belief that we'd always keep reaching for more. But the story didn't end in the ashes because you're still here. And if you're still wondering, then hope didn't burn completely. It just got quiet. So sleep gently tonight, and tomorrow, light something new.